Exposure Systems, Chapter 32. System Selection. The father of radiographic technology in the U.S. was Ed Germain. Principles of exposure charts were available in the 1920s. Arthur Fuchs developed into a scientific system in the 1940s. Technique charts reduce personal repeat rate and excessive patient dose. The function best with large number of variables can be constant and can vary with a single factor. The goal is to provide a method of consistency in the quality of the image production. Charts should be provided with each X-ray unit and revised when necessary. If you notice inaccuracies with chart, bring to the attention of your safety officer or adjust the chart. Technique charts are even more important with digital systems. Comparing exposure systems. All systems vary and have their own advantages and disadvantages. All are designed to provide consistency in quality image, and everyone should use the same technique charts. Personal preference will occur, but should not affect the outcome. Comparing exposure systems. Technologists may develop personal preference. This should use system employed by the imaging facility. Students should learn all possible systems before making a personal selection. And again, this is something that you probably already started to do. I know that I've talked about your cheater books, and so hopefully you're using those and writing out techniques that may or may not work for you. Exposure system selection. Exposure systems often incorporated into pre-programmed control consoles. Its suggested starting point. It should be revised by the radiographer when necessary. Each system has advantages and disadvantages. Variables changed according to anatomical part thickness. Important to use calibers when not using AEC. Measurement of part thickness. Part thickness was explored by Fuchs, and you've got a table in your book on 32-1 that also goes into this a little bit further. It must be taken into account to produce adequate X-rays, otherwise excessive patient dose and repeats. The caliber is used to measure part thickness, central ray, entrance to exit, and the thickest part. It must be followed by all users in the department. Exposure systems. There's 3 types that we're going to discuss: the fixed KVP, variable KVP, and anatomical programmed radiography. Fixed kilovoltage systems. Systems first produced in 1943 by Fuchs during World War II. Advantages: decrease patient dose, provide more information, increase consistency of the receptor, lengthen exposure latitude, reduce tube wear, decrease time settings, and easier to remember. Disadvantages: more scatter radiation, lower contrast, which is less appealing to the eye. It's not as often adopted into facilities. Variable kilovoltage systems. First approach established by Germain in 1925. Permit small changes in exposure to compensate body thickness. Permit finer adjustments of KVP settings. Advantages: higher contrast, enhanced visibility of fine detail and resolution. Variable KVP system disadvantages: more patient dose, higher repeat rate, tube wear, etc. Principles of variable KVP exposure systems. KVP is varied, while mass is constant. The thicker the body part requires higher KVP value. Mass is specified for each body part. Advantage: small incremental changes for small changes in part thickness. Not able with fixed kilovoltage. Varies mass, insufficient number of settings on exposure timers. And you have a table in your book on 32-5 that gives you example of those variables. Disadvantages: KVP affects a multitude of radiographic variables. Varying KVP from image to image lessens our control over these variables. Increasing KVP reduces contrast. So higher KVP, you end up with lower patient dose. KVP is appropriate for the body part, so the patient dose considerations less a factor for fixed or variable exposure systems. Anatomically programmed radiography. Computerized exposure control system stores technique chart in its memory bank inside the control console, and it can store any type of exposure system. You must have an automatic-based programming. Factors can still be adjusted by the technologist, but primarily just suggested technique is given. It should be monitored and maintained for accuracy. So this is something that you're already using today. So when you push the button that says hand and a technique comes up for an AP hand, again, you can use that as your base technique. If it's really off, then again, you would need to monitor that and then change it so that it would be accurate. AEC, or exposure control systems. Again, we've talked about this, or AEC, quite a bit. So your APR system incorporates your AEC. Selection of time, mass, selection are eliminated. Professional judgment still should be used for all other factors. You need to learn when to use it and when not to. And it's kind of like we discussed previously, that if your APR already has a humerus and is using the AEC, we always want to take that off, because we know that, again, the image will not come out as well with AEC. And again, you can adjust that and have it changed within your APR so that it will not calculate AEC next time. Establishing an exposure system. Produce phantom images, select optimal phantom image, prepare an exposure system, phantom testing, clinical and ongoing fine-tuning. Establishing a technique chart. So begin by collecting data. So hopefully you've already started this process for your technique chart. And already you have a good basis of how you might want to complete yours by doing your abdomen charts last semester. Make a single exposure that produces an optical quality image that's within the acceptable limits curve. The first data is from your subject part size, so maybe 10 to 25 centimeters, or KVP range, which would be the 60 to 80. Figure 32-3 shows steps that we are going to discuss. Initial phantom images. Test exposures are made to determine optical quality image. The phantom is exposed to a combination of technical factors. Exposure should remain at the same control point to avoid misperception of contrast image. AEC is preferred. If no AC, the density reference control point must be established and measured with a densitometer. Select optimal phantom image. So after production of the phantoms, evaluation from the radiologist and your supervisory radiographer that's over control of the quality control. You should reject images outside the acceptance limits, and then eliminates the conflict of opinion and narrows down to a series of films that are acceptable. So again, it's not the perfect image that we're looking for here. It's because we know that it is subjective, so it may not always be the perfect image for someone else. So you're just eliminating these so many are bad, these so many on the top end are bad, over penetrated, under penetrated, and you have a set in between that you like. Extrapolite technique chart. A series of clinical trials to evaluate adjustments to technical factors. 15% rule can be used for part thickness adjustments. Attention to narrow range parts and few technical factor choices. Phantom testing. New chart is then tested with a phantom to verify effectiveness. All should include a median of small and large thickness size. Completed for all projections. Clinical trials. Series of trials to test new chart. Each exam should be recorded and repeats analyzed. If new image is accepted, the new chart should be implemented. If it fails, you should readjust and test all over. Make sure new techniques are optimal before used on patients. Clinical fine-tuning. All technical factors must be recorded, good or bad, which allows for fine tweaking the chart. It provides verification and techniques and adjustments for more optimal images. Ongoing fine-tuning. Establishes quality control monitoring method. QC technologists should be consulted when technical factors differ. So kind of remember that we discussed before, as your machine ages or your tube ages, it can require just a different technique. Or you might end up with like a series of unexplained rejects, which may signify a change in the system and can be determined with quality control testing. So it may be something wrong with the actual machine if they start to alter or change too much. It all should be fixed by the service engineer, and again, with older equipment, you just might have to keep an old technique. Principles of fixed kilovoltage exposure systems. Works best with large number of variables, constant, and change only a single factor. KVP held at a constant for given range of contrast and densities. Mass is allowed change. KVP affects contrast, type of interaction, production of scatter, average photon energy. varies depending on, and we just kind of discussed this looking back in a few chapters ago, our generator phase, filtration, machine calibration, intensifying screen conversion efficiency, subject of the inner shell binding energy, etc. It eliminates effects of variables on exposure system, concept of optical kilovoltage peak, uniform contrast and easily remembered KVPs, so mass values can be used to be within acceptable limits, and there is no varying grayscale. Advantages and disadvantages. Advantages would be decreased patient dose. They're always at max level, so we end up with decreased mass. It's a consistent KVP, which ends up with uniform contrast and allows for comparison of images. It lengthens your exposure latitude, decreases mass, which also lowers your tube heating and extends your tube life, and then reduces time, so there's less patient motion. Disadvantages: lower overall contrast, less appealing, more scatter radiation, so it ends up being a little less pretty. It may not be achieved with equipment that varies mass, less variety of MA and times compared to KVP settings. Optimal kilovoltage peak. The definition is the maximum KVP level that will produce images with appropriate contrast that are consistently within acceptance limits. It must ensure sufficient penetration, if not limits the diagnostic region around the edges of the contrast. Reduced MA decreases tube heating and prolongs anode life. Reduced time, we mentioned, minimizes patient motion. So optimal KVP is low contrast and minimal patient dose. So low contrast, more shades of gray, less mass, less MR. Establishing optimal kilovoltage peak. Optimal KVPs are established for fixed KVP systems. Specific range for subject densities and contrast. It should not be changed unless conditions change or acceptance limits are changed. Initial phantom images. Fixed KVP system requires a series of exposures acquired with an abdomen or pelvis phantom. Hint, this might be a test question. Remain at same control point so that misrepresentation of contrast range will be avoided. AEC should be used or a density reference control point. Select optimal phantom image. So after your phantom test, your objective is to get the highest and lowest KVPs within the acceptance limit. Again, not always your best. Highest KVP equals your optical KVP. So it's an elimination process. It's not about, again, that best process. It's about figuring out what's the highest and what's the lowest that could possibly use per phantom. Careful consideration of subject density and contrast before deciding the optimal KVP. Extrapolite technique chart. By adjusting technical factors to new established optimal KVP, and again, the 15% rule can be used. Mass is the primary variable here, so increments of 25 to 30%. Again, we know that's how much it takes our visual eye to be able to see mass changes. But if we're going to make an adjustment to mass, we know that we do it by doubling or halving. And the rule is for every 5 centimeters, which ensures proper penetration. Phantom testing. Assessed before patient examinations and can be classified in small, medium, and large. That's another hint that you might consider including on your charts that you're creating or your technique charts for this semester. You can classify them in small, medium, and large, or you can give them centimeters. And if you do use small, medium, and large, make sure that you give a key to what you think small, medium, and large is. If employed, the part size less than 10 centimeters, and KVP will be outside the diagnostic range between 60 and 80. Fine-tuning of an extrapolated chart. Approved for clinical trials. And you have a table on 32-3 that gives an example of a fixed KVP technique chart, as well as a table on 32-2, and that just shows you common optimal KVP ranges for body regions. So this is kind of the simplified version since it hasn't changed very much from before. So clinical trials, all images recorded with repeats saved for analysis. With minimal repeats moves on to fine-tuning. Fine-tuning, we adjust and validate the chart. The new chart can now be adopted. And then fine-tuning maintains accuracy of the system and diagnostic process. Historical development. So early on, the radiographic practice, we had a +2 KVP for each additional centimeter of tissue. 30 kVp was constant added to achieve kVp high enough to penetrate the part. Increased kVp scales of 30 was not always enough. And that's what we see today. Really, no system actually goes all the way down to 30. Usually the cutoff somewhere around 45, just for that purpose, so that it actually will penetrate the part that it's aiming at. And again, you've got a table 32-4 that's just an example of the 2 kVp per centimeter. Basic variable kVp formula. So 2 kVp times the part centimeter plus 30 equals your new kVp. It really wasn't very accurate. kVps were often too low, so multiple scales were needed to penetrate high-density body parts. The plus or minus 10 was used to compensate for doubling and halving mass. Mass values determined through trial and error, listed for each thickness body part, and creating useful technique charts. So Fuchs in 1948 came up with a fixed abdomen at about 80 kVp, and that's still pretty accurate today. Mass is varied with size of patient. Similar results to a fixed kVp technique. So results of variables kVp, MA, and time. Variable kVp system flaws. The 15% rule, not thoroughly understood, so used a plus or minus 10 kVp as compensation for doubling or halving mass. Nonlinear changes occur when kilovoltage is altered. So at lower kVp, this has a dramatic effect on the image. So this is just giving you an example of increasing kVp to high can reduce fine detail. So the very first image we'll look at is the one all the way to the left of your screen, and so that is at 52 kVp, so it has high contrast and low kVp. The one directly in the middle is low contrast at high kVp, and that was used at 115 kVp. The one all the way to your right is more of an ideal contrast or look to it, and it is the correct kVp, which was used at about 70 and is considered acceptable to the radiologist. Some more variable system flaws. While at higher kVps, the effect is not as profound. Thus, plus 2 for each additional centimeter of tissue is largely inaccurate. Fixed value of mass and proper exposure of average patient. Thicker patients will be underexposed as the patient size increases. Patient difference is noticed by the technologist, so you should compensate with an increase or decrease in mass. And we've talked about that previously, so we know that a thin patient may need less dose compared to a very large or obese patient. Establishing a stepped variable kVp system. Variable kVp systems used today have evolved from earlier systems. Straight variable kVp charts often resulted in too much or too little contrast. So kVp for extremely large had excessive scatter, and extremely small components not enough to actually penetrate. So remedied with multiple kVp scales, and a table on 32-6 gives an example of those variable scales. So there are 3 criteria for the kVp scale. 1, all film contrast is acceptable to the radiologist. 2, small part kVp recommendations provide adequate penetration. And 3, large part kVp recommendations limit scatter and fog. So your initial phantom images use straight kVp chart like 32-5A through C to select kVp based on part thickness. Place the phantom in a variable depth water bath to simulate changes in part thickness. Repeat the radiograph if the image is too light or too dark with an adjustment in mass. Select optimal phantom image. Over and underexposed are repeated with appropriate mass adjustments. Repeat until diagnostic. The kVp is not altered for part thickness. Patient equivalent phantom, or what we call PEP, reduce or eliminate the need for patient exposures. So the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, recommends a PEP. If no PEP, a plastic wastebasket with water will be used. Select optimal phantom image. Images produced will have a wide range of contrast. They must be evaluated by all radiologists, and this evaluation will provide acceptable kVp levels. The mass scale. Step 1, acceptable kVp range is determined to be 70 to 84 kVp. This range must be applied to all part thicknesses. Step 2, acceptable kVp range must be compensate with mass via 15% rule. Step 3, fine tune. So again, these are just examples. This is not going to be tested over, but if we had a 14 centimeter part, it should be radiographed at 84 kVp. It would be changed to 76 via 15% rule. If it was 31 instead, then it should not be radiographed at 70, and it changed to 78 via 160, still a 15% rule, and or the 4 to 5 centimeter rule. Remember, the 4 to 5 centimeter rule states to permit doubling or halving of mass to maintain density. Again, this is just the simplified version here. So phantom testing is prior to examinations and will be done in large, medium, and small part size. Clinical trials, all recorded with repeats for analysis. Few repeats, you move on to fine-tuning. With fine-tuning, we adjust and validate the chart. Once the chart is adopted, we move on to ongoing fine-tuning, which maintains accuracy and accurate record of modifications. These are a couple of websites that I thought were really useful in showing you the steps to creating an exposure chart. So you're definitely able to use those if you choose to and kind of explore how this was done. The end.